Thank you.
Mr. O'Donnell, I believe you had a question or comment?
Yeah, just do a couple questions for just a couple of the panelists. With regard to the plan implementation and the design of the plan and some of the outreach, maybe this question is for Mr. McGovern, if you will. Has there been outreach to your organization as to what maybe this plan could look like and getting some feedback from your organization?
Yes, there has. We've had opportunities both in the public processes like the Freight Advisory Committee. The agency's had multiple workshops around the state this winter. ARB and CTC have both had this on their public agendas, and we've also had an opportunity to meet with the staff from the agencies.
Great, thank you. So maybe this next question is for Mr. Cervantes or Mr. Dolan. I don't know either of you. What has been the outreach to your industry?
Well, likewise to Mr. McGavern, we've been involved in those discussions, but I think the struggle, as we've been mentioning, we've really been trying to hammer this competitiveness aspect and trying to get them to raise the profile of that in those discussions. But we have been involved and have had outreach from them.
Okay, so we're looking at basically three pillars. There's the GHG reduction, there's competitiveness, there's efficiency. I don't know, maybe not that order, but either way, those are the basic pillars. So when you've been in these conversations, do we talk about efficiency, competitiveness? Where does that come in to those conversations? Or where has it? Maybe you could. Anyone of you are free to. Anyone.
From our perspective, it hasn't in a meaningful way. I think there's been so much ambiguity and vagueness in the draft action plan itself. The only metric that's in there that we've seen is when we look at efficiency itself, has been in the 25% reduction in HGH.
Assembly member, the agencies did stand up a freight efficiency strategies development group. We did participate in that. From our standpoint, from the Port of LA standpoint, and we participated in many of these conversations, it's a massive program and policy integration effort that's being undertaken under the executive order. And while there are policy and program that has evolved around air quality and freight planning, the competitiveness piece doesn't really have anything quite that's commensurate with the existing policy and program around air quality and freight planning. And this is where there's a huge imbalance and an opportunity, frankly, to flesh that out and develop that more fully.
So we have a metric associated with the GHG reduction, no metric on efficiency, no metric on competitiveness. Is kind of what I'm hearing, and also really a qualitative discussion about what that might look like.
Yes, and so one other piece that I would also offer, again, back to when we look at the competitiveness and we evaluate from a data perspective the difference in importing product through the Southern California Gateway versus bringing product through Georgia, for instance, through Savannah. It can take us, from when the last mooring is tied on the vessel, it can take us over a week to get a container through the Gateway. For us to get product through Savannah consistently takes a couple days tops. That's why we think there's so much of an opportunity to educate and to advocate a little bit more loudly, specifically for the competitiveness piece, especially with where it stands today.
And in your mind, maybe that speaks to building a better partnership as how we formulate the plan, but also really implementation. I go back to the Clean Trucks program, right? Started maybe 10, 12 years ago. The vision, then it was implemented in the subsequent years, and that was really a partnership because there was also funding for that to be implemented. Is that your vision? Is that kind of where you're going, or?
I think from a funding perspective, it's obviously a much larger conversation. But I think with respect to some of what those goals are, there are conversations to be had around investment in equipment and trucks. And I know that there have been some conversations about that and whether or not the state would invest in new trucks, some of the cleaner technology trucks, as a way to potentially subsidize that piece specifically based on the goal of the 100,000 trucks as it is now. But I think that there are other opportunities to continue to grow the overall freight that comes through the Gateway as well for us. And so again, we have a large percentage that we're looking at now and this is completely separate of the labor conversations that happened between the PMA and LW and the challenges that existed there. When I talk about it takes a week to get product out of the Gateway today, that's based on what would be qualified as a more normalized environment over the last few weeks as a for instance. So again, from a growth perspective, in order to continue to maintain flowing product through California, it's a great way to partner together in a much more collaborative fashion.
Great, and I think a good point to make is that it's not only technology; it can be just practice. Look at PeerPass, right? Probably an efficiency that could be addressed as well. And then you brought up someone offered you, or someone offered through the process that they could have MBA students look at this. I mean, this really isn't a school project. Give me some feedback on what you heard.
I think as we raised the point previously, and this is over the last maybe 5-6 months, Mike Rossi had offered that would be the potential solution to do this work, to understand the economic feasibility or the whether or not there was an IRR on what some of these investments would be to support this. And when we had advocated for and had offered to provide input on what some of those solutions might be, the initial conversations centered around there wasn't a desire to slow the process down of moving the executive order forward. And one of the outputs was where there was no funding for the economic analysis to be done, this was one of the ways in which it could be done.
Okay, so and I've heard that there has been no funding allocated for the economic analysis, so that greatly concerns me. We can ask that question when a different panel comes up. Because then I wouldn't want something done on the other side, the GHG reduction just to be done as, kind of a student project. So, trust me, I'm a teacher, believe in education, want universities involved, but we have to really make sure what we're doing is solid and really thought through and professional, not just kind of an experiment, if you will. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Mr. Dow, is it clear for you how the Sustainable Freight Action Plan would integrate with your local plan?
Mr. Chairman, at this point, we're not sure. To be frank, to be candid with you, we're not sure at this point how the Sustainable Freight Action Plan fits in with you mentioned earlier in your opening remark with our regional transportation plan, on the many ongoing efforts that are kind of leading us to the same direction, a unified policy for the state freight system. I often wonder if this document, is it a strategic planning document? I'm not sure. Is it a transportation planning document that was developed in the way that the freight mobility plan was developed, that was developed in the way that the TCIF document was developed back in 2007? Is this a programming policy document that we've seen developed by the California Transportation Commission for other funding program? So at this point, that is some of the questions that we have related to the plan. And we, again, as in my remark, Mr. Chair, we're more than committed to make sure that we have ongoing dialogues. I know that the draft report was issued only last month. And I know that through the California Freight Advisory Committee structure, we will have future conversation regarding what this plan really is for and what is its purpose, key purposes, and how is it going to be implemented down the road.
Well, I go back to how you mentioned your sales tax measure has an expenditure plan, was approved by the voters, and if this is contrary to what your expenditure plan or your voters had acknowledged, how do you accomplish something that is completely contrary to what your RTPCs and your locals who know the area intimately, who wanted to create their own destiny and are paying for it? How do you work with the contradiction?
Let me just tell you that our voters approved expenditure plan have significant funding to relieve congestion on the national freight network that is traversing all over Alameda County, which support the entire Bay Area region. And we have solutions for some of these problems that we're encountering. We have significant investment in the Port of Oakland. As many of you know, is the 5th largest port in the United States and the #1 export port in the United States by volume. That number is falling very quickly because you mentioned competitiveness. I think we're losing out to Savannah and Houston and places like that because of regulations and higher benchmark that we have to perform and operate under. So we have significant funding to making sure that our port operating more efficiently, and that's the name of the game these days, Mr. Chair, as you know. So and it's very prescriptive in our expenditure plan how funding is going to be used. So I think it's going to be a challenge for us to do something very different than what the voters has intended to do. You often heard the phrase promises made, promises kept, and we intend to making sure that as we go out and find solution for our freight system in Alameda County, which again support the entire Bay region, that we're going to keep our promises to the voters.
Thank you. Mr. Dolan, in your opinion, what needs to be done to improve efficiency if you had the genie in the bottle?
Well, first, I think what has to happen within California is that California has to get back to remembering that it has a strategic advantage, different from the rest of the United States from a supply chain perspective through the ports. I think there are a number of different things that can be done to drive both efficiency and effectiveness. In fact, some of the things that happen today from a congestion perspective, from a lack of infrastructure and development perspective, whether it be hot infrastructure, roads, and final mile connectors, as well as some of those IT investments that were spoken about earlier when we think about port-wide scheduling systems, there are a number of different things that would drive value and benefit for California today. What we are, and we have been willing to do from the beginning, has been to come together and offer up what some of those solutions are and to talk very openly about what we're experiencing across the rest of the country as we're importing freight in.
Thank you for that. And, and again, I don't think there's anybody in this room that doesn't want reduction in GHGs and the best air that we can actually breathe. But when we look at these goals, when we go after this zero emission technology, if all we're accomplishing is putting electric trucks in gridlock and them just sitting there and not moving product, all we've accomplished is nothing, or a very small percentage of the goal. And what I'm looking for and striving for is a better value when we make the investment, so we actually take the low-hanging fruit right now and maybe get things moving so that the particulates aren't as heavy in the disadvantaged communities, and we can work through mobility and throughput that way. Then we can work towards everybody's goal of electrification. But right now we have a short-term problem. Nothing's moving in these pinch points. And so I'm looking forward with your expertise, working with the agencies to make sure and keep us informed. Because if they're not listening to you, then they need to listen to us. So I'm looking forward to that going forward. But I want to thank each and every one of you going forward. And again, Mr. McGavin, when we talk about disadvantaged communities, the best thing we can do for those individuals is put them to work. And so I'm looking forward to working with each and every one of you on that issue. And again, to the ports of LA and Long Beach who attained a long time ago and didn't get credit for it, but continue to be part of the process, and to the truckers who are demonized for actually being part of the process of moving our economy. One of the things that I will say that in this latest court ruling, how trucking industry and the California Air Resources Board was a little bit appalled about the response from the agency when we talk about going forward and bringing collaborative action to people that are working together. We want them to work together and not beat on each other. You lose one, you may win one. But the whole thing is a partnership, and we want to be able to make sure that industry and the agencies have the ability to utilize each other's expertise and work towards the cost-benefit analysis going forward of what's the best value investment going forward so we can attain the highest amount of attainment. So thank you again for your participation, and like I say, we're not done. You'll be back. So thank you so much. Now we'll pull the panel of Kome, Richard, and Will. Kome, please introduce yourself and who you're representing today, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Kome Jason. I'm the Chief Deputy Director at Caltrans. I'm here today on behalf of Brian Kelly, Secretary of the State Transportation Agency. Well, I'm glad to be here today to provide an update to the committee on the progress made since the committee's January meeting hearing on this particular plan when you had a hearing on the Sustainable Action Plan in January. The draft documents reflect a collaborative effort from 3 state agencies and several departments that express a vision for the state's trade system that is both in the state's economic and environmental interest. The work was undertaken based on Executive Order B-3215 signed by the Governor on July 16, 2015. The order directs the Secretaries of the State Transportation Agency, Environmental Protection Agency, and the Natural Resource Agency and relevant departments to develop an integrated freight action plan by July 2016. The effort will culminate with the delivery of the action plan to the Governor by the end of July of this year. There are really 2 key objectives that we try to accomplish with the action plan, among several. I just want to lead with that. First is an alignment of efforts into one single vision. We have several agencies that work around freight in some capacity and trying to make sure that there's an alignment in the vision statewide. The unprecedented collaborative effort on behalf of all the agencies involved in developing the plan has been in of itself of value. This is by bringing a common understanding and into close alignment a singular freight strategy that works towards achieving the state's transportation, climate, air quality, and economic goals and objectives. So the intent, really, one of the intents of this effort was to make sure that we have this alignment in terms of state policy around freight. The second key objective that we accomplish with this plan is to build these broad partnerships. And I think the first panel talked about the stakeholderships that are out there and how complicated the freight business is. The action plan sort of signals that the state needs to further collaborate with stakeholders in transitioning to a sustainable freight transportation system. The foundation of the action plan is the acknowledgement that the state needs to continue to build long-term partnerships with the legislature, with the federal government, with regional agencies, local governments, communities, and industry stakeholders to affect the outcomes proposed. The involvement, and by no means are we expecting that the actions that are in this plan will be done exclusively by the state agencies around the table or involved. It's really intended to be part of this larger stakeholdership in terms of completing those actions. The involvement of the primary stakeholders throughout the plan development, especially the California Freight Advisory Committee and the freight efficiency working group that we set up, has helped us to not only inform the plan's content, but also forge very valuable connections. So what are we doing moving forward? The action plan is a milestone. It's really a milestone on the way to a more sustainable future by providing a broad direction and specific actions to be worked on in partnership with our stakeholders for many years to come. The unified vision, the guiding principles, and the targets help frame that long-term effort. The specific implementation steps to be taken by the various agencies also provide very tangible means by which to achieve the desired outcomes. These implementation steps, which include first, further work with the legislature on freight funding issues, second, regulatory and incentive development to advance freight technologies and fuels, and lastly, to convene experts to help develop and deploy freight system competitiveness and efficiency strategies, including freight workforce needs, expedite project delivery, and pilot projects. These are all parts of the efforts that are in the plan. The 3 proposed corridor-level projects, pilot projects, integrate clean technologies, alternative fuel, freight infrastructure, and local economic development opportunities to improve California's trade corridors. Now, in terms of the comments that we've gotten so far on the plan, the draft action plan was released in early May, and it's available for public comment through July 6th of this year. The document is posted on a dedicated website, californiasustainablefreight.org, where all comments are posted for public viewing. It's really intended to be a very transparent process. In addition, the interagency team has been actively engaging stakeholders through public and focused meetings. Once a plan is finalized, periodic updates will be provided through all means, especially through the California Freight Advisory Committee, and a full progress report is intended to be prepared by 2018. Now, comments so far that we've received can be broken into three broad categories. One which I'm going to discuss further regarding transportation funding and efficiency, and the other two regarding freight industry economic competitiveness, which my colleague William Koch will talk about, and the third about environmental community elements will be discussed further by Richard Corey. Now, in the first area of comments that we received, which has to do with just broad agreement on the overall need for additional dedicated freight funding, overall support for continuing efforts to improve freight system efficiency, and also to initiate pilot projects. In regards to the comments heard so far, there is a broad agreement on the need for freight funding. There is a general support that we need to continue to find ways to make the California freight system more efficient. And as we had proposed with the pilot projects, it was really intended that we would use those to begin to exemplify what types of technologies could be applied on the freight system. With regards to freight funding, stakeholders widely support building upon the success of Prop 1B, the transportation bond measure approach of improving trade with complementary programs that invest in freight infrastructure and cleaner equipment simultaneously. Freight efficiency improvements, especially actions beyond the control of any one entity, would also be supported as part of this process going forward. The initiation of pilot projects to demonstrate an integrated approach is seen as means by which we could see a more transformative change in the process. Now, we specifically focused on the department side. We focused on the efficiency portion of it and led some of that effort. And the comments we have heard have been very supportive across industry on ensuring that we need to move forward. And the items that actually came through the discussions on efficiency are identified in more detail in the working papers that we had put together in that effort. We have not heard much feedback on pilot projects since the release of the draft document, draft plan. But most folks have asked why we are proposing only 3, given the good ideas that we received. And those are all parts of the discussions that we're open to discuss today. With that, I will turn it over to my colleagues, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
So, Mr. Cook, we're going to go to Mr. Corey because the agenda shows us in that order. And so you just sat in the wrong chair. Sure. So, Mr. Corey, please proceed and introduce yourself and who you represent, please.
I will. I'm Richard Corey, Executive Officer of the California Air Resources Board, and thank you, Chair Frazier, as well as Chair O'Donnell. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
And Mr. Corey, I'll just say in the essence of time, if you have an overlap of what Comey has talked about, please skip it. Go on to the relevant issues.
It is separate and distinct, but I will move through it quickly.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. You just heard my colleagues on other elements, including the economic comments. So my remarks are going to focus on characterizing, responding to comments and concerns to date on the environmental and community elements of the plan. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So I note that written comments are due early July, which we expect will further describe the issues and recommendations. So we'll have an opportunity to go through those, given the fact that the plan has just not been out but a few weeks. Most of the input on the environmental components of the plan have come from air districts, environmental groups, and advocates for communities directly impacted by freight operations near rail yards, ports, distribution centers. The logistics industry has focused its comments on one potential approach to reducing freight air pollution from freight facilities. I'll start by discussing comments that reflect the community perspective and discussing comments and then move on to comments from the logistics industry regarding the facility cap concept, which you touched on earlier. From the community perspective, the key message that we've heard is that the plan should place equity issues on an equal footing with the other sustainability priorities to support efficiency, the environment, and the economy. There are two equity-related elements: improving conditions in communities and more effectively involving communities in the state and local decision-making processes. Specifically, the plan must improve on-the-ground conditions in these communities by reducing toxic pollutant hotspots from diesel trucks and equipment, as well as community safety and related issues. These advocates have asked the multi-agency team to ensure the targets in the action plan are ambitious enough to deliver these improvements. They also urge ARB to add more commitments for new statewide air pollution regulations to further reduce community health risk. Another theme in the comments from the community and environmental organizations has been the desire to be involved as partners in the decision-making process. Whether designing freight infrastructure projects or developing new air quality and energy programs, communities want the opportunity to participate in all stages of the planning and implementation of the actions of the plan. Moving on to an issue of interest to both community and industry stakeholders, the role of freight facilities. Air District, environmental, and community interests are advocating for new regulations to directly reduce the health risk from diesel pollution in communities near freight facilities. Industry and port stakeholders want to ensure air quality progress in general, and a facility-based approach in particular does not limit California's ability to grow its logistics industry and all its associated jobs, the very point that's been discussed at this hearing by several. And as directed in the executive order and demonstrated in the draft plan, the agencies believe that we can support logistics growth and achieve our environmental goals simultaneously. But that will require building on stakeholder partnerships, also mentioned, to develop and implement the right mix of carefully considered strategies. For example, the draft plan includes actions to press for tighter national and international emission standards. Without them, the engines used in international ships and interstate locomotives will continue to meet less stringent emission standards than the trucks and equipment that operate in California. One of the options we'll further discuss with stakeholders is an emissions performance target for freight facilities like rail yards and ports that cover all mobile emission sources serving the facility. With this approach, the owner of the facility or equipment would have the flexibility to determine the best way to meet the emissions target. This is in contrast to a potential approach where several new measures are developed to meet the same target, thereby reducing on-site flexibility for the owner on how best to meet the target. This type of facility performance target could be achieved through regulation, through enforceable agreements and incentives, or through a combination of approaches. In a prior ARB document, we labeled this concept as a facility emissions cap. Unfortunately, some incorrectly interpreted the term facility cap to limit cargo activity and growth at our ports and throughout the state, which is not the objective. Cargo activity to serve California needs and the international supply chain will and need to continue to grow. The issue at hand is how we can accommodate this growth while still achieving a net reduction in air pollution for adjacent communities. The draft action plan recognizes the need for substantial additional emission reductions from freight operations in California and includes a wide range of tools to achieve those reductions. A freight facility performance target is one of several options in the toolbox, along with incentive agreements and source-specific regulations. While we'll be gathering data and continuing to evaluate all potential strategies to further reduce freight air pollution and community health impacts to meet the goals of the draft action plan, are legal. We have requirements in terms of proceeding. National action on tighter emission standards, for example, the development of cost of advanced technologies, the state's ability to secure dedicated funding for cleaner freight equipment, freight efficiency gains, and other factors will all inform our consideration of the most important path. As noted, as we proceed to determine which air quality strategies to pursue. We'll be working with our state agency partners, logistics providers, local air districts, and affected communities in a public process consistent with the guiding principles in the draft action plan. We'll continue to seek partners and creative solutions that advance the goals of the governor's executive order to improve freight efficiency, the environment, and the economy in California. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. Mr. Cook, would you please proceed by introducing yourself and who you represent, please?
Good afternoon, Chair Frazier, Chair O'Donnell, and committee member. My name is Will Cook. I'm the Chief Deputy Director for the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. Of the 9 key state agency actions listed in the draft plan, GoBiz is serving a leadership role to support 3 of the actions. I would like to talk very briefly a little about these actions and that GoBiz is taking the lead on. Also, even though the public comment period for the draft plan is still open, I'd like to share with you some of the feedback we received to date specific to our work as well. To begin, under Action 4, GoBiz will lead, in partnership with the California Energy Commission, zero-emission market forums to discuss the status of zero-emission vehicle market, including supply chain, technology development, commercial viability, and the role of regional and local economic development organizations in supporting the industry. GoBiz has already started working on mapping the hydrogen fuel supply chain and held a meeting earlier this year with representatives. We have heard from the stakeholder community that this action will help improve access to the best possible equipment available as the industry begins to make new investments. Also under this action, GoBiz, in partnership with Caltrans, the Air Resource Board, the California Energy Commission, would seek to engage in international actions that help other regions move toward a more sustainable freight system. GoBiz already plays a leadership role in international economic development affairs and would work with other agencies to support development of memorandums of understandings with other governments and confer with international leaders on sustainable freight topics. One of the challenges we have faced as we work through this effort is developing a realistic and meaningful target for increasing the competitiveness of the freight industry. Freight industry stakeholders recognize the need to develop these metrics to measure and monitor the industry competitiveness. As it stands, there are gaps in our state databases that inhibit our ability to effectively measure the detailed economic impacts of the state actions on the freight industry. Gaps in terms of, like you mentioned earlier, Chair Frazier, reliability, throughput, cost, and velocity. Additionally, this dilemma is compounded as there isn't a uniform measurement of competitiveness across each industry segment, which is why Action 6 of the plan is so important, and GoBiz seeks to address this challenge. In doing so, GoBiz will convene public and private stakeholder groups to determine the appropriate data to be acquired, develop a suitable metric to measure and track freight industry competitiveness, identify or develop robust modeling tools, and conduct ongoing benchmarking of the state's freight industry in an effort to track competitiveness at a regional level. In our conversations to date, the freight industry has committed to working with us to collect the necessary data to help us develop these metrics and monitor them on a regular basis. Additionally, Action 6 of the draft plan identifies GoBiz as the lead agency to convene stakeholder working groups to develop strategic marketing programs and campaigns that promote California's freight transport systems, capabilities, and achievements, while leveraging its California location and unique competitive advantages that we heard earlier about. Freight industry stakeholders have shared with us that they are pleased to see this action included in the plan. Finally, Action 8 speaks to the critical need of ensuring our state's workforce is capable of meeting the future employment needs of the freight sector. Stakeholders have shared with us how valuable having a trained and skilled workforce will be to them as they continue to adopt new technologies. The draft plan proposes to connect GoBiz, the California Workforce Development Board, and the private sector in collaboration with the regional workforce development partners to meet this goal. For example, one action in the plan is to develop a robust and integrated system of pre-apprenticeship pipelines and journey-level upskilling programs. GoBiz will also work with the Workforce Investment Board and stakeholders to develop training models that can be replicated along key freight corridors and help support development of community workforce agreements whenever possible. GoBiz believes that the tasks I've outlined meet the intent of the governor's executive order and will provide meaningful support to the freight industry as it continues to modernize its operations and increase its competitiveness. Since our last hearing, our team has continued to meet with dozens of stakeholder groups and business owners and operators to ensure that the plan reflects the true needs of California's freight transportation industries. These meetings also help form the actions in the plan that I discussed earlier. We look forward to continuing our work with industry stakeholders, our agency partners, and the legislature as this plan continues to take shape. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'll move to a couple of questions real quick because I've got to be somewhere at 5:15. There are literally dozens of proposed actions. How will the administration prioritize these, and what will the funding source be? A. And how are we going to pay for these 3 pilot programs that's been identified? Any one of you?
I'm going to start with the pilot projects. The pilot projects really are intended to be examples of how you can break through silos and do work that would benefit us on all 3 counts that we've put out. So we're looking at three projects that we've identified. I'll focus on the 2 that I think the department's going to lead on.
Just have to tell me, I understand that there's going to be pilot projects. I just want to know how they're going to be funded. And
well, the funding is going to come from wherever funds come from to do those things that we do. In other words,
so you have no identified source of funding at this point?
Well, some elements of the project have funding on them. And so the idea is to continue to think beyond, for example, if you look at the freight corridor projects that we're leading at the department, our focus automatically would have been to just look at it as a transportation project. But with the discussions we've had on this plan, we're looking at beyond that. So we're looking at things that are more innovative along the lines of technology. So how could you bring technology to bear on the corridor to also help improve the efficiency of the corridor, at the same time reduce emission load on the corridor?
But how do you pay for it? That's my question. How do you're putting this out here? You have a plan that says it's got to be out by July 2016. How do you pay for it?
Well, like I said, these are ideas that show ways you can improve the corridor. The fund sources, we're going after every fund source available. There are existing funds. There are funds that we don't have yet. So there are elements of the corridor that will be developed in phases.
It may never be funded and never happen.
Well, that's possible. But the idea is if you don't plan it, then you don't know that you need to do it. Okay. And so the concept, if you look at the border project, for example, the border project is intended to bring technology to bear. We don't have the funding to do everything we want to do. But
see,
because
what
we've
I'm
identified...
saying is, Comey, is that there's this rush to put this plan out, but we don't even have the funding to make the pilot projects work.
Well,
but what I'm saying is, why are we taking and implementing something so fast when we don't even have the funding, number one, for the pilot projects? Number two, we don't know... in this vast, where it's already been identified that we have a metric for GHG reduction, but we don't have a metric for the efficiency and the economic impact. And shouldn't our focus be on accuracy rather than speed, getting these things out? I mean, I'm not in a hurry.
And actually, this is a really deliberate process. If I can just maybe correct a notion out there. The intent of the plan is not to rush out and do something. The intent of the plan is really to unify our vision on freight from all perspectives so that we're all pulling in the same direction. This is the beginning.
So you're willing to slow the process up if industry says that they don't feel like they've been heard? Because that's the impression I'm getting from some of these folks that were at the first panel. They don't feel like their input has been implemented in a fashion that works for them.
Well, again, so what you heard is that I heard also that they have been part of the process to this point. What I'm suggesting further is there's a lot more to be had in the process going forward. If you take a look at action step 7, which is system efficiency, it calls for a number of things. Now, it doesn't talk about it in the body of the plan, but if you go into the appendix C, you could see a detail of things that we will do under action step 7. That talks about working over time. This is really the beginning. We're talking about multi-year discussions that leads into other plans and other implementation actions.
And I think I have to go back to what Assemblymember O'Donnell had mentioned about once an idea starts, it becomes a regulation at some point in fashion. And we don't want that process to be started with this when we definitely looked at the trailer bill language that would direct the CTC to revise the TCIF guidelines to conform to policy direction from the action plan. What specific changes do you see need to be made to the TCIF guidelines to implement the action plan in the way that this administration intends?
Well, first of all, the TCIF guidelines is based on bond funding, and it assumes all of the trappings of bond funding. And so that guideline needs to be amended to match where funds are going to come into freight. The governor's proposal intends to fund freight. And so that's one element. How would we bring that kind of money into freight funding? I think we're saying we like the success that we have with the TCIF process in terms of funding projects and how it also brings in stakeholders at the regional level. We want to continue that, but there's also a need with this plan to understand that there's a state imperative in freight, and so the state also reserves the right to be a big player in the discussions about freight so that we focus investments appropriately. That's not to the detriment of the regional coalitions that are out there. I think it's inclusive of that. And so that's really where that's going. So as we approach updating the TCIF guidelines, it's really with that intent. It's not intended to do away with it in any way. It's to enhance it such that we can bring funding into play.